Given that there's not that many people, I think we can just like kick it off and there's like any other questions. I kind of have like a headache, so maybe we'll like end it like 15 minutes early or something like that. But yeah, we'd love to jump in. Have any feedback for this week and any other general questions on how the course has been going so far for everyone?
Can I ask something?
Yeah, of course.
So thanks so much for the great course. So one of the key takeaways for me is the power of the generating synthetic data. So not only it help us test our precision and goal, but it can also be used to train models more effectively. So that's kind of great thing for me. Yeah. So thank you so much. So I have not a one, but a question, but it's not related directly to the course. That
No
case.
problem,
So
no problem. This is
yeah.
time for everyone here.
Okay. So I would also like to hear about your consulting experience side. So such as how to acquire clients or your offers, the pricings and the sales and the consulting process itself or something like that. So
Is this from the perspective of like also wanting to do your own consulting or?
yeah, kind of just thinking. So which way? So I have right now I'm just a software engineer job for
Hmm.
the game industry.
Hmm.
But starting from the side hustle or something, I am considering the different direction as well. But there's a bunch of options like creating a software SaaS business or consulting or to an agency type of things. So just a curiosity right now, but yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think there's really like three internet businesses that you can build, right? There's the consulting side of things, there's a SaaS business, and then there is an agency work. And I think each one is going to be very different. For example, with agency, a lot of it is going to be sales and hiring focused. And you got to ask yourself if that's the thing you want to spend most of your time doing. For SaaS is obviously going to be probably like 80% building a product
Mhm.
and then maybe 20% marketing, unless the product is very undifferentiated, in which case a lot of it will be marketing, but those are kind of the skills. Whereas for consulting, really it's the easiest one to spin up because the product is your own knowledge. In which case,
Yeah.
if you already believe that you have the skills, the main thing we have to focus on is thinking about understanding not only how we can sell a list of tasks,
Mhm.
but really figure out how you can be responsible for the success of the company,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So I think in terms of sales, like that's mostly the most important part, and that's the skill that you need to develop. The skill isn't just can I build AI or can I do that, but it is really understanding, okay, what does the company actually need and how can I be responsible for the success of the
Mhm.
company, right? The
Yeah.
story I
Yeah.
always tell was in January, I was helping a client. It was like $9,500 a month for a couple hours a week, but I was helping them hire people. I was helping them build their roadmap. The roadmap we used was help to hire people. And at the end of the month, we made one hire. Or we made two hires. So in that
Mm.
month, I got paid $9,500, but the recruiter made $40,000. Right?
Mhm.
The recruiter's contract is I take 25% if you hire them. You hire two people, and then they said, not only that, we'll give you your money back if they don't stay within 3 months. So their pay is like very structured to the outcome that the company understands, right? The
Yeah.
recruiter doesn't sell, I'll do 25 interviews for you. I'll screen 200 resumes, and for any other 20 resumes, I'll charge you $200. I actually know what you want. So the biggest skill to develop as a consultant is understanding what does the
Mhm.
company actually want. And if you can figure that out, then you can price yourself in a way that is going to be more structured on the value you deliver rather than the tasks you're going to promise somebody. Because if you say, "Oh, I'll build you an application," is that
Mhm.
$90 an hour? Is that $200 an hour? But if I say, "Oh, this
Mhm.
application is going to make you $1 million in the next year," then $80,000 is cheap. But you wouldn't
Yeah.
ever ask for $80,000 for 2 months because then you might be saying that you want to charge them $2,000 an hour. But the difference might be not only will I build you the software, but maybe I'll spend more time talking to your customers for you. I'll really figure out
Mhm.
what you need to build. And I'll make sure that the demo that I make you is also something that is ready to be made into production. And I'll make sure that I'll help you hire an engineering team so you can take this work from me so you don't have to hire me for the rest of your life. But that's because what I
So
know
how do
you want is
you,
like customers and
sorry.
stuff like that. Go on.
Yeah, yeah. So how do you manage the expectation of the business side? So you promise that something improve the ROI, something like that. but eventually we can figure out how to do it.
Because if the company does not know the ROI, then they also do not know how much they're willing to pay and how important it is to the business, right? So it's like if the customer is doesn't understand, it's almost a symptom that they don't understand what the problem is, and they'll never be happy. That's what
Yeah.
I've realized. A lot of companies who say like, "Oh, we'll just give you a flat rate, like maybe like $8,000 a month. We'll ask you some questions." Sometimes we don't even talk for 2 months, and I just like I think we should end the engagement because you guys seem very busy and I don't like taking your money for no reason. But other
Yeah.
companies, Jason, we are losing $100,000 a month because people are leaving our service and they're leaving our service because our AI system has hallucinations. Great. I'll help you measure how much hallucinations you get. I'll help you correlate
Yeah.
whether the hallucinations is the leading cause of churn, but you already know that. And let's see if we can reduce the churn by half, right? I'll prevent you
Mm,
from losing $50,000 a month. I don't think we can do this for $50,000 over the next 3 months. Here's my plan. I know what you
yeah.
want is lower churn by reducing hallucinations, and my plan is doing A, B, C, and D. And it's going to take 4 months, right? But
Yeah. Yeah.
if they don't understand, if the customer does not understand, I usually I realize it's because they're a bad customer. Because when you buy things, you're like, I don't know, maybe I could do it myself, maybe I can do it later. But when you're really in pain, you're like, I need to see a doctor because I'm like bleeding out of my eyeballs. Like there's no more confusion. So I think that the pain is a big deal.
Right. So initially, how do you find a potential client and how to access it?
Yeah, I'll answer this question, and then I also want to make sure that Ashutosh also has some time. But most of so there's four ways you can get customers. You can do
Mhm.
free content, paid ads. So there's four things you can do: free
Yeah.
content, paid ads, cold outbound, warm outbound. Right. So when I started my business, it was mostly warm outbound through my own network. Right?
Mm-hmm.
It's just going to be, can I work for you? You don't have to pay me, but I want like a good testimonial, or I want to be able to have a referral
Yeah.
because
Yeah.
I know this person. After I'm done and you like the work, can you introduce me to this person? If you're not comfortable, introduce me to this person. Can I use your name when I reach out? Cold outbound, I'm not going to do much. Paid ads doesn't really make any sense. The other thing is free content. So when I am answering a bunch of questions for people and understanding what everyone's pain point is, you have to write in a way that says, not only do I know what your pain is, I know the actions I need to take to get there. So if my clients are having issues with hiring, I'm going to write hiring posts. And then other people will say, hey, Jason, I found your post on hiring. This is really informative. Can you help us plan our job descriptions and help us figure out what kind of team do we need? Right? A lot of this
Mm-hmm.
course is informed by all the problems that came from the consulting, right? Like the first 5 companies I worked with, the engineers like, it looks better. Okay, what for what? It's like, oh, we're using Ragus. I think it looks better. I was like, how much did it improve? Oh, I don't know. I was like, okay,
Mm-hmm.
well, we need evaluations. Oh, we have no customers. Okay, we need synthetic data. So you write and you write and you write, and that's another way of doing it. But I would say warm outbound and free content is usually the way that I think about scaling in a business like this. Agency work and SaaS, that's a lot more cold outbound, a lot more paid ads. You have to focus your energy on product. But again, that's kind of how I think about it. Do you mind if I just jump to Ashutosh first, and then maybe we can come back if there's any other questions? Yeah,
Thanks.
no problem.
Hey, so first of all, I thanks for like setting all of these courses and speakers and all the material, Jason, and Dan, you all have been like putting out like even outside of the course, like on your website. So definitely wanted to thank you. It's amazing. I mean, it's a tremendous resource. The question I had is also kind of related to this course, but a little bit on the edge,
Mm,
which is about your views on these agentic architectures or agents, and just to separate some of the hype from the real value they
mm,
bring, when you think those are like good architectures to consider, and specifically things like classifications and intent identification and RAG and retrieval, like all these things are already building blocks, right?
mm,
One thing that I have understood that agents bring to the table are things like flexible memories in some sense, which is
mhm.
again some kind of retrieval or managing data stores,
Yep.
but also dynamism in plans or planners and things like that, right? Which is sort of hard to kind of upfront think about all scenarios and write out like in code, even if you have access to classifiers and all these other things. So that's my take. But where have you seen like agents or agentic frameworks or these designs actually give like a material improvement in what was otherwise possible just by classifiers and retrievers and hard coded kind of data flows?
Yeah, Dan, I don't know if you agree with me, but I'm very bearish on agents as they stand today. I think for the most part, if we think of like the 80-20 rule, the 20% of the work is the long tail that we hope agents can work well in. But I think 80% of the results of a successful business, or at least in like the B2B context, is very much sort of mapping and automating workflows and standard operating procedures. And I think there we can add strict guardrails to actually do things that are economically valuable because we have these guardrails and have managers manage teams and how teams have processes that they want to automate. I think a lot of the economic value will be sort of mostly in automation with these kind of guardrails rather than the agents' work. Because some of the things I think people want agents to do, humans can't even do, right? And the humans that can do it because they have a well-established system. Like I think that's where I think a lot of the risk is, right? If I just tell a human get me more customers, they have no idea how to do it. But if we say, okay, there's these 4 pathways: free content, paid ads, cold outbound, warm outbound. Let's build systems for each one. Then the loop sort of goes off a little bit more. Dan, did you have anything else you wanted to?
Yeah, I mean, I'm actually, so I am in theory optimistic about things that are agentic, though many of those are like even doing a web search and finding answers to relatively simple questions today requires a lot of back and forth. The first time that a model tries to do a web search, it's not going to find exactly what it's looking for, and it probably needs to update what sort of search it does. And so that starts to look like agents. In the call with, or the presentation by Cohere today, at the end, I asked them how much of the calls being made by their models are calling out to simple conventional retrieval from a, let's say, vector database, and how much of it is some sort of other function call. And they said that they're putting a lot of energy and research into building models that can do a good job of flexible multi-hop function calls, and one function call will lead to the next function call without human intervention, but they're not seeing much activity there because the models aren't good enough. And that mirrors what I see, like whether it's self-healing on a web search, or earlier on, I assembled this little robot. The blurring is screwing things up, but it's got function calling to do basic movements. And so I wanted to see, like, can I ask it to navigate to a part of the room that has a certain object? And in theory, it should be able to look around, find the object, walk towards it, take a step as a function. And all the parts conceptually make sense so that it should be able to do very rich things. And empirically or anecdotally, it can't do that yet. But I'm bullish on it in the future, but then anecdotally have seen many times that it doesn't work well yet.
Yeah, thanks for sharing the views. So just to separate, and if I could take like another few minutes on this topic, but one of the things that so I am 100% in the space of given some kind of natural language input and a bunch of context, can it translate into some kind of structured output or like as a function call with parameters and things like that? So that I think totally makes sense. It's incredibly useful. The place where it starts kind of being like a disconnect for me is the claim or this goal where all these different kind of almost like independent code paths which are behind the agent. So maybe some agent has certain functions and certain kind of behavior and certain like system prompts and what it can or cannot do, and then like participating in a group to try to solve something. And in this process, kind of the next speaker selection or basically the data flow becomes kind of indeterministic, right? It is up to how one agent responds, and maybe the leader of the group or the next set of agents, whoever raised their hand, like whatever the agent framework is, would then decide, okay, now you go, you try to do this. And in some cases it makes sense. For example, if there's a coding kind of agent, there is a part where some agent kind of creates a code, there's some kind of executor that runs it. In case there's an error, it goes back to the coder with the error. So that's more like a deterministic system. And I would even say that calling them agents is kind of nice as like a mental model, but it's not really like an open-ended loop, right? I mean, there's a deterministic loop that there's a coder, and if there's an error in execution, it goes back to the coder and so forth. And if everything like looks like right, then it's considered as the result. And I could even write it like as a loop with a deterministic control flow. The part where the control flow itself becomes non-deterministic based on all these kind of actions going on is the part that I wanted to ask, like, have you had experience where that itself is the value? Like basically things like planners, right? So if I have some kind of goal and I have a sequence of things I could do or a sequence of agents that are available, deciding at runtime or even as results come in, what should happen next, and take those paths as part of like this agent communication, that is the part that is less clear to me. Like, does it even work well enough? Like, is it robust enough and those kind of things? As opposed to if I just had classifiers in my system that look, I have these three things,
Yeah.
I'll do an intent identification. I'll put it to one of the code paths. I'll get the result. Again, I'll do a classification like did it serve the user's goal or not. And if not, again. So basically, I'll still retain the control flow in a more deterministic manner, even if there are kind of conditionals involved that involve an LLM making a
Yeah,
determination.
I'll say two things, right? One, it's I really believe that any complex system has to be a derivative of an existing complex system. And because we've seen things like these like DFS state machine type models with intents, that has worked in the past. So I think if we apply LLMs to that system, we can build something that's going to be a little bit more robust to some noise, right? So that's one angle. The other thing, though, I think is just like a funny joke, really, is an engineer tells a PM that it's going to take 1 month to build something, and then the PM says, "Okay, what if I got two more engineers?" And they said, "Okay, with two more engineers, it'll take 3 months to build something," right? And I think every engineer kind of hears that, laughs, and like understands the joke. But then when people start want to build these agent systems, they want to build out these like seven agent systems with editors and reviewers and all that. And the more I sort of manage teams, or even the more I manage like upworkers that are like kind of like at the level of abstraction as agents that don't have the understanding of the hierarchical goal, right? So Masatoshi, we talked about how there's like tasks and then there's like business objectives. I think most of these agents understand tasks. Most of these upworkers understand tasks. And managing those teams is just very, very difficult, right? Unless we train a model that actually understands what the global objective is, right? But that's very hard. It's very hard to hire someone and say, make me more money. It's very hard. But it's easier to say, I think doing marketing will make me more money. It's even easier to say, I need to have 3 channels to do my marketing. I need someone that is good at warm outbound, cold outbound, paid ads, and paid content. And then if you go then hire an agency that does ads, then you tend to make money because what they can say is, we will make sure that when you spend $1, you make more than $1. And that objective function is very simple, right? But I just think that transition from tasks to objectives is very hard for these generic language models still. I think it's possible in the future, but even now, like one of the things I push a lot in this course is really like think about just having one big prompt, right? The default should be one prompt with a lot of chain of thought rather than these like multi-agent systems that to me, I've never hired like 5 Upworkers instead of one good Upworker and like felt really good about the results unless I take way more effort in figuring what's going on, right? And I think I'm just treating it now as like every time I hire Upworkers, every time I use LLM models, they feel the same to me. In which case, I would almost rather just hire someone who knows what my goals are rather than trying to divide the work.
Yeah, thanks. So I think net, in my view, it's mostly once we have some really great planners like LLMs being able to plan really, really well,
Yeah.
given, like you were saying, given an objective and some kind of context of the domain, or just figure out the domain context from retrieval.
But I
Do a
think the question then
sequence
would
of
be
steps.
like, where is that plan coming from? I'm barely a good planner. Like, where is this trading
Yes.
coming from? Right? Like, we have to. It's like now we have to ask our humans to plan better, and I barely describe my processes. Right? Like people plan better by like reading books on planning, right?
Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
like it's like I'm paying like hundreds of dollars or even thousands of dollars on like marketing training right? You guys here are paying like money to understand the plan on how to build a system, right? It's because that plan doesn't exist. I think it's like we have to actually write these things down. I think many people are not
Yeah.
there yet, right? We don't even have the user plans rather than the synthetic plans of the training. So I think we need a lot more work in being able to do that kind of data capture. Do you mind if I jump over to Omar and Joe as
Sure.
well? I just want to make sure everyone
Thanks.
gets time to answer. Omar, do you want to shoot your question?
Thank you guys for having this session really early in the morning. It's really nice. One question that I had was regarding to, so I can just give a bit of context first. So we have I work in an investment company, and they have but they do a lot of due diligence, and one of the due diligence value streams is basically collecting a lot of information. And then they have actually specified a bunch of questions that they need answers to, right? So just basic due diligence stuff. And one of the things that we are trying to look into is a report generation. So based on these predefined questions, how can you basically figure out which documents are relevant and then present them as a report? So I was wondering, is there anything I should be aware of regarding the evaluation, or do you usually follow this kind of RAG-based approach?
Yeah. So I would first try to go back and ask whether or not they have any existing data of reports generated with questions and answers and data rooms. Because you might be in a situation like if they have this data, you might be able to say, well, let me put the data room into this like RAG architecture. Then let me take some existing question answer pairs, do RAG on the question, and then for these text chunks, use a language model and say, would this text chunk have contributed to this answer? And that's your first way of bootstrapping your precision recall evaluation. If you can do that, then you basically have some kind of existing baseline, and you can start iterating on that. Does that make sense? Like if you had access to some
that makes a lot of sense, Jason. And we do have access to a somewhat poorly written report.
I'm sure. Yeah.
But that makes a lot of sense. Thanks.
And then you can just say, okay, we did this. The system today is 70%, right? We're going to have 3 experiments. What are the failure modes? Now you have something to look at. You can probably figure out of these like 60 questions in the report, are there just questions that we're just getting 0 recall on? Like, hey, customer, we're going to figure out, like, we have 3 ideas to focus on this aspect because we are unable to do background research well. We're going to come back to you in 3 weeks. We're going to tell you how much we've improved because we've implemented these systems, right? And I think that, again, is just like a very good confidence booster of, we saw what was going wrong, we're going to come back next month, it's going to be better.
Right.
But I would try to just, as much as possible, just bootstrap your evaluation set first, and then just start setting goals against, even just like per question, precision and recall, right? It's unlikely it's going to be flat across the board. There's probably some things you're doing really well on, you can celebrate, and some questions you're just not possible. But that would be my first step.
Thanks.
Yeah, let me message me on Slack. I'll introduce you to Nicholas and Brian. Both of them are also working on due diligence type work. And so I think it'd be cool for you guys to get together.
That'll be awesome. Thanks.
Awesome. Joe.
Yeah, hello.
Yep.
Yeah, thank you for the course and this session for different time zone. I have 2 questions.
Yep.
First is, are there any tips or points to keep in mind when summarizing lengthy meeting minutes?
Yep.
For example, extracting specific topics discussed in the meeting. And second question is, if I want to search for people who spoke on particular topic in proceedings, what would be the great approach?
Yep.
Yeah, this is my questions.
I'll talk about summarizations first. Like the 2 things that happen too often for me when I do summaries is that the language model overwrites too much of what is spoken into its own style. So I have a lot of prompts that are around, like, as much as possible, use the same like language and words as was in the transcript, right? So that's one issue that is just happens every time, where it'll just be too abstract. Just like preserve the style and preserve the words of the original transcript. The second thing is just making sure that the length is appropriate for the length of the summary. Like the danger here is you give it a 3-hour lecture from MIT and the summary is the professor talks about the importance of mathematics. It's not very useful. So there's a length component that you want to really constrain for. And usually what I actually do is I actually just measure the length of the summary versus the length of the transcript. And I have targets for what that number should be, right? And then the third thing is just like sort of, this is something that is talked about in Ivan's blog post on chain of density, where you want to make sure it preserves as many like named entities as possible. So like right now in our call, there's like Joe has a question, Jason has an answer, right? You don't want the summary to be someone asked a question and then the speaker answered, because then you're losing a lot of information about this data. So a lot of it is going to be around preserving the original entities in the conversation, right? So it's like, make sure you preserve the names, make sure when you are summarizing things, they are summarized in a way that preserves as many name entities as possible, include all the important points, and make sure that the summary's length is in proportion to the length of the transcript. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Are there any well-known method for creating longer summaries?
Not really. I mean, there's generally like the prompt I have is just make sure the summary is the summary length is in proportion to the length of the transcript, and then you just measure that ratio, and then you can just ask yourself, is a 40% summarization too little or too much, right? If it's too little, you have to play with the prompts, and every time you play with the prompts, you run your evals, and you just look at this percentage and see if it goes up, right? Unfortunately, that is like the best answer. Like I've built like 3 summarization tools, and it really is just every prompt has like a summarization ratio and distribution, and I just move it up and down the scale. The second thing you asked was about like who said what, right? If it is not the most important thing, I would just basically put the entire transcript into the prompt and ask the language model to reiterate everything. If it is very important and you have like specific understandings of what the meeting minutes are supposed to be for, one of your summarizations could just be what was the for every speaker in this conversation, like extract out speaker and intents or feelings that they had about the meeting, right? So for example, in a brainstorming meeting, you could have a system that says, okay, for every speaker, what were their ideas, what were their critiques, what were their worries, and just do more structured extraction to make that easier for yourself. Because I find that if you just search like transcript lines, you don't get enough information, to be honest. But I would really recommend looking at week 6. The last third of the content was mostly around like monologuing and chain of thought. I think that's usually the right approach when it comes to trying to do better recall on some of these tasks. Does it make sense?
Yeah. Is there a post related to this on the instructor website that
If
I
it says
can check?
chain of density, there's something there. But if you
Okay.
message me on Slack, I'll make sure we can sort of I'll share some of my existing prompts with the.
Okay.
Just make sure you
thanks for the answer.
message me on Slack. I will respond. I just need to take some time. Yeah, Ivan just shared in the chat.
Thank you.
Jay.
Thanks. Well, thanks for doing the course. It's helped me tremendously. And when my system, when our product launches, I'll send you a link. Sure. The question, sorry, is as part of my day-to-day work, like I'm involved in multiple projects at once, and sometimes a product manager or a manager will come to me and say, here's a tool that's answering questions. Look at this demo. This is a great demo.
Yeah.
And so my responsibility is sort of like to vet anytime if someone comes to me like to vet like which vendor should we go with and if we should build it internally or not. So they would come to me, oh, here's a product. I saw this demo. It answers questions amazingly. Should we use this for our lead gen chatbot? And sometimes some of the concept that we have talked about has given me a few things to evaluate against, like with test data, test questions, like and stuff like that, and see how the system responds, and give them a more like enough for take our use case and run it. Like, but how do you approach a problem like that? Like when people just throw vendors at you, especially because every vendor that we use now has AI in them.
Yeah.
They're all coming to us and say, oh, we have AI now, and now buy this upgraded plan, or like here's a new vendor.
Yeah.
How do you approach this kind of evaluation?
I can talk about literally what we used to do for evaluations, which is just the same thing I say every time, which is we have existing data sets and evaluations and goals, and then we try to have these vendors evaluate their technology on our data set. And the example I have in Stitch Fix is many companies have this like, oh, if you add our button on the checkout page, we'll tell you what the fit is, or we'll tell you what styles they are. And we're like, okay, here is 10,000 customers and 100,000 products. Predict the like satisfaction score. And we just compare that with what the true answers were, right? Because we knew, did customer one buy product two? We know that, but they don't know that. And so the question is, great, here's the data set. You tell me if it's good or bad for each customer. And then we evaluate our own end, right? So, and it's the same thing as almost evaluating these embedding models, right? I just have a precision recall metric. I'm not going to tell you what your baseline is, but if you have to beat our baseline, and when you beat our baseline, it has to be at a cost that is meaningful to us. If you're 0.5% better, but you're asking for $2 million a year, I have to ask ourselves, is 0.5% worth it? For this, like, if it's like a RAG context, like I would be curious if you just came up and said, hey, here's 50 questions and 50 good answers. Send it to every vendor. Show me what those answers look like. And you have to make sure that you poison the data set a little bit. It can't be 5 perfectly worded questions, right? It has to include questions your system can't answer because your system is not complicated enough or smart enough. But you also have to ask questions where you can't answer it because the data is not in there. And if it does answer a question, you're like, okay, well, you don't know when to say no. And you can report back on some of these metrics, right? And just making sure that the data you give them is a little bit tricky so they can catch some of these things. And this is basically what I do with job interviews too. I give people data that's broken in some way. And if they come back with me with answers and don't even tell me the data was messed up, okay, you didn't look at your data. A simple example is like, well, I'll give you finance documents but two companies, I'll multiply all the numbers by 10. And if you can't figure out that like Uber revenue wasn't $1 trillion, I can't trust you because you didn't even think about the problem you were looking at. And so it's a bit of like maybe 80% real data, then 20% like checks and safeties to make sure that they know what they're doing. Is that helpful? Like, do you feel like you could produce that kind of test for them?
We have baselines for sure, right? Like there is baseline, and there is an analyst doing this work today, and they have a certain level of efficiency, like 70%. They get it right 70% of the time. And I have that data, and you can say, okay, now use your chatbot, like run it through your API with the same questions that the chat customer asked, and see what your system responded with. Yeah.
Yeah, like even if that system was 65%, I'd say, oh, if I do that system and all I have to do is make the analyst review work, that might be a ton of savings. But you're not going to replace the analyst, right? If it's 90%, it's like, okay, maybe you're lying. I just don't, right? But I think it's a matter of, yeah, like making sure that the test that you give is diverse. And it's not just like reasonable examples. You need to understand how the system works at the edges, right?
Yeah. Yeah. And I think questions that our system cannot solve is a great one to see like how true is there. Sometimes they might make the system work for the test data set that we give them and say here's no response, but the poison is a very smart idea. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, because I just feel like there's, again, it's like language models are trained to give answers that make the person happy and like happy with the result. Really, like it's not about like right or wrong. It's just like, it's preference, right? So there's a big chance that the language model will give an answer that looks good and like makes you happy. Whereas like the real answer sometimes is like, there's no way I should answer this question. There's no way we have the data to answer this question. You actually need to go do your homework and give me more information before you ask me to answer this question. That's something that's hard for the language model to do.
And there's also a variation where we don't have a system like that, but AI will bring in new business sort of vendors. Like we don't have a summarization we don't have summaries at all, like, but now we should add it.
Yeah.
Like how do we evaluate that kind of, like, systems don't exist. I think it's a matter of like, okay, minimum effort, just put something. A lot of times teams would go and then say, okay, Microsoft Copilot Studio, let's just dump our content there and put a chatbot in. Should we do, like, it comes back later saying it's not good enough after the fact. Like it's hard to push back on ideas like that.
Yeah,
the investment is very low, right? It's $200. You put all of your content in there and you get an API and a chatbot. You check the box, but nothing happens because of that.
Yeah, I think maybe not for that Microsoft vendor example, but I think one thing that is worth considering is the job of your first couple of machine learning products isn't even like to do machine learning well, is to give you a surface to collect data to build a really good model, right? Like like if your machine learning system is like almost a coin flip, but it's not really hurting anybody, then every once in a while the coin flip is going to be successful and the coin flip is not going to be successful. Then you can use that as signal to sort of train a better model, right? So I think it's really valuable. Like even if it has no contribution today, the question I would ask is, does the process with which it generates data allow me to build something better in the future? Is that process hurting users a lot? Like if it's just really bad user experience, maybe not. But for summaries, I don't know if the summaries will hurt somebody, but maybe it helps people make decisions a little bit faster. And then the question is, can we get enough users where we can A/B test summary prompts? There's some predictive signal in what people are looking for. When summaries are bad, are people giving me feedback, and can I incorporate that feedback into a better summary? Right? Maybe this feedback is like, these summaries never contain the numbers I'm looking for. Okay, cool. In the prompt, let me make sure that like we capture every single number and every number is formatted in like bold. And they go, oh, this is useful because the numbers are correct, right?
Yeah.
But I really wish I knew who said something. You give that feedback. Goes, oh, these summaries are useful, but they're too short, they're too long. And you can just hill climb your way into a better product, even though the initial summary was just summarize this transcript, right?
Yeah.
You can still slowly like hill climb your way to better performance. Viraj?
Hi, Jason. Hi, Dan. Thanks for the wonderful course and this extra session as well. So my question is, we have an agent right now and which has a planner as the first step. So we want to evaluate the planner right now. So how do you, do you have any thought process on what are some of the things we can do while evaluations? And a second question is how we can plan to improve it further. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah. I have my main thoughts. Maybe Dan, I'll ask you to talk afterwards. But there's two specific things. The first one is I would ask myself, what's the percentage of workflows or plans that I generate that are like actually correct, right? Like, oh my God, Omar's just driving right now and on camera, just making me super nervous. Oh my God, Omar, drive safe. So the first question is, when I produce these plans, this plan is being sent to some other system. And can that other system tell me whether or not that plan is correct? For example, if my plan is a chain of functions, are the types of an output function that goes into another function, like, is that the correct type? There's some checking that we can do, right? So the first question is, do we have a checker? And for that checker, what's the pass rate? The second thing I would think about with these plans is improving few shot examples, where if after a conversation I can generate a plan, maybe what's worth doing is having a summary of that conversation and saving basically the summary and the embedding of the summary and have a pointer to the plan. And so when another person talks to the system, it can say, oh, this request looks like these three requests. And for these three requests, these were the three plans that were proposed. Use this to improve your model. And then you can ask yourself, okay, does that improve the correctness of the model? Does that improve the satisfaction? And then as you get more data and as you get more feedback data, you can make your few shot examples higher quality. So maybe I only include an example if the example was both correct and it is executed and someone gave a thumbs up, right? And just making sure that you're just curating the examples really well, because that's what's going to happen in practice, right? You're trying to fix a car, the engine's broken, great. Let me go open up the instruction manual. There's like 30 things that could be wrong with the engine. Let me figure out which of these two makes sense, and let me look at the problem, right? That's, you're kind of modeling just the instruction manual, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, the only things I'd add is log the full trace so that you can afterwards go back through. And my somewhat limited experience, but my experience has been that you can, if this is a circumstance where if this is a use case where you can see afterwards verifiably what passed and what did not, my experience has been that you can look through individual traces of plans that failed. And there's a lot of common failure modes. And so instead of being so zoomed out that you're just sort of guessing what to do next, even if you find an individual trace and say, here's one that we know has failed, figure out as a person, what do I think is a series of steps that we should have done or what should we have done at each step, and figure out a way to change that small detail and get that one right. You're going to see many test cases get fixed when you look really closely at one and fix that one.
It almost feels like we're just applying the segmentation, but on the failure modes, right? There's basically, is the plan correct? Are there a family of plans that we can few shot? Are there a family of error modes that we can segment and address specifically? And then how can we filter down that set of few shot examples that we've curated? I think that's been like a general pattern that I've been seeing more and more of.
But yeah, and the other general pattern that I see is people who are not logging enough, so that at every point they just sort of guess like, what did I recently read a blog post about that people say works, and then they make a change, and then they sort of eyeball some things and say like, maybe it got better, but I don't really know. And so, or they just want to stay at a very high level of abstraction and not look at individual traces. And so the human failure modes are to not measure and not be concrete.
Yeah, totally. But those guys, I just give them their money back. It's like, if you're not committed to this, I can't help you. Viraj, what do you think?
Right. Makes sense. Makes sense. So we are logging right now all the traces that we have. So we have the data. The problem happening is, how do we evaluate the plan right now at scale? So there is one option is human annotation itself, but that will give us like maybe few examples. How do we do at scale? Because even if we evaluate the response, what happens is we have a plan and we send it to some other system which executes a lot of steps. Maybe one of the steps failed. So we don't know whether the plan failed or whether the step failed in between. That's why we got the wrong response. So how do we go about tackling this?
Yeah, I would just have to, if I was working this project, I would just have to see if I can categorize both failure modes of the plan being incorrect and nodes being sort of probabilistic, and just look at those distributions and see like what we need to address first, right? Because again, it's rarely going to be a case that like there's a 50% chance the plan is incorrect, and then for every node there's a 50% chance a node fails, right? There's probably going to be something a little bit more concrete. There might be specific functions that just have low success rates, and we might want to think about addressing those things first, right? Because ultimately, through this entire thread, you're always going to have some bottleneck. And so whether or not we can evaluate the plan as a whole is going to be very hard, but at least we should at least sort of quantify the assembly line, so to speak, and just figure out like what that that bottleneck really is. So I think it'd be hard to give a recommendation without actually seeing those specific examples of what is the plan failure mode, and then for these individual parts of the plan, what do those failure rates look like, and can we just improve it incrementally?
But,
it might be
but
too hard to follow the whole system as a whole.
I also think you need to consider not operating at scale and instead saying we're going to work on a human annotated sample, because I have a strong hunch that you've got some recurring failure modes, and that you could operate on a relatively small number of samples, fix those failure modes, and the fixes that you apply will generalize, and that you don't need 1,000 samples to identify that.
Like maybe a good analogy to think about is like if I'm a doctor, you're kind of asking me like, how do I stay healthy? But that's almost like too general of a statement. It's like, really, okay, if you want to stay healthy, let's figure out what's like the least healthy thing about you. Is it your weight? Is it your blood sugar? Is it your cardio? Because ultimately, like with your system, like maybe something like usually it's going to be something specific, right? It's not just you're just baseline unhealthy, but the system is unhealthy. But you need to we still need to figure out what the bottlenecks are, right? And if it just costs more money, like the difference between a human and an LLM is just dollars per token at this point. It might just be critical for you to invest more capital and try to see if we can justify that.
Got it. Makes sense. Makes sense.
Because I think it's really hard to just figure out like what part of a plan is failing. Because for example, say for Zapier, really what might be happening is, okay, the compose email zap is just way more complicated. That you think is just subject and body, but it's not. It's also like attachments and CC and BCC and all that stuff. And then like there's permissions. And maybe the issue is actually just auth and permissioning, right? Maybe it's around how specific parts of Zapier's integrations are communicating with each other, right? If we have that, then we can actually enumerate every single connection between two zaps and figure out what the successes and failures are. And then that's how you sort of really narrowing down into specific parts of that business, right? It's less of like, can we make the zaps better, but just identifying that, oh, really the issue is like the Gmail integration is very confusing for the language model. And if we change that function, the DAG would execute a little bit better.
Got it. Makes sense. Thanks, Jason. Thanks, Dan.
Yeah, I would just say try to cut up that data as much as possible until some segment is showing like signs of bad health. Like it really does feel like you're like the doctor trying to figure out like, okay, you're sick, but is it a cough? Do you have a headache? you have a stomach ache, how bad is the stomach ache, and really just identify like what's actually going on.
Got it.
Yeah, I know that's not the most satisfactory answer, but a lot of it is just we have to just aggressively look at specific examples. And like there's been times where like I worked at giant companies, I just spent weekends like labeling 1,000 samples. That was like probably the most expensive data labeling job someone's done for like on an hourly basis. But the result is still like incredibly valuable, right? And like it's just something that we have to do. And just because there's cheaper options now doesn't mean we should always go with the cheapest option, right? Like there's plenty of cases of just like buy nice or buy twice. And if we just use LLMs and they're not good, most companies are still using humans because they're still very, very good. But even if you use humans, you'll still have to figure out how to write all those instructions, right? Now, it's not going to be the case that you give a human, like again, with this agent system, you can't just tell the human, these plans aren't working, tell me what's wrong. Like that, they're probably going to be very bad at that job. And you still need to be very specific and say, okay, I want you to identify plans that have failed. For plans that have failed, are there nodes or are they plans or are they the edges? You don't really get, it is not really easier with humans. It's just a little bit higher accuracy if you can front the money for it. Like prompting data labeling teams and hiring up workers is the closest I've ever gotten to working with LLMs. So I'll just say I have like 10 years of experience working with agents. But yeah, were there any other questions? Any thoughts, feedback?
Sorry for.
Do you plan to have a next series of courses on some interesting topic?
Not that I know of. I think my only goal right now is to roll this course again in early February. I've been thinking about making some like consulting content for Maven, but yeah, I think that's just because I just wanted to see if I could write a book. A lot of that is just hiring humans to do it, just because I think I've learned a lot about like marketing and stuff like that. I think that's worth sharing for folks. But nothing too specific. I think if for me to come up with new material for another course, I'm going back to doing just like consulting again to see if I can get any more case studies and get any more examples. A lot of this is just informed by getting my hands dirty, so I gotta make sure I keep doing that. But I think my next couple of clients are in private equity, so we'll see what kind of problems they run into.
Well, best wishes for whatever you do next. This was amazing, and thank you again.
Yeah, and just keep up on the Slack. We'll send emails out and let everyone know what's up. Yeah,
Yeah, I'm very interested in if you create a consulting side of course. So
yeah, I've read too many books on marketing and like entrepreneurship and consulting for me to not try to see if I actually know something. So we'll let you know if it comes out. Awesome. Thank you so much for the kind words, everyone. I think this is the last time we're seeing each other, but there's going to be a Tuesday session next week where Doug Turnbull from Reddit is going to talk about search relevance. And I think sometime next week, maybe is going to send out like a feedback form for everyone to like share testimonials and do 5 stars. I feel like an Uber driver, but please rate 5 stars. That means a lot to us. And yeah. Take care, everyone. It was a pleasure.
Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you.
Take care.